Welcome to The Wilderness and the Well. I'm Cece Henderson, your host and the founder of the Sanctuary International. This is the space where we have honest conversations about spiritual formation, aligning with purpose, and walking with God through the highs and lows of life. If you've ever felt lost in the wilderness, you're not alone, because in the middle of it, God provides wells of refreshing. Today we're starting a brand new series called From Burnout to Breakthrough, where I'm sharing my personal journey through burnout, healing, and stepping into a new beginning. In this first episode, I want to take you back to where it all started, the moment everything came crashing down. I want to start by asking you a question. Have you ever ignored the warning signs in your life, physically, emotionally, spiritually, until things completely fell apart? Because that's exactly what I did. For a long time, I was running on empty, overcommitting, saying yes when I should have said no, feeling the weight of responsibility for everyone else's needs. I thought I was being strong, but in reality, I was draining myself dry, and I didn't even realize how bad it had gotten. When I look back, I can clearly see the symptoms of burnout I ignored. Let's just start with the constant exhaustion. The tiredness after a day's work, coming home to my responsibilities as a mother, going out to attend church meetings to meet those responsibilities, planning and organising the sanctuary events. Always tired, always exhausted, never having a single day in the week where I had nothing booked, but just pushing through anyway. Then there was the struggle to experience joy, even in the things I once loved. I love music, but no longer was music being played in the house for pleasure. Only picking up my guitar to prepare for the next worship set, rather than indulging in the joy of creating new sounds. And then there was the deep sense of disconnection from God. In my journal, I was writing questions. I'm going to read some of my journal to you. My questions were, does our walk always have to be a struggle? I feel so confused. Is it really meant to be this hard? My brain feels frazzled. I can't seem to know what is right, what to do, and how to do it. Is this how it's meant to be? Lord, this is hard. And I find myself thinking, can I even hear you in the midst of this? How much of what I hear is you, and how much is programming? I was struggling, feeling like there was no way out, but still pushing through. And what came next would have been the irritability, the anxiety, the growing resentment, and that constant question of, Lord, is life meant to be like this? Monday to Sunday, I would be getting up to go and do. Monday to Sunday, I would come home exhausted, ready to push through in the next day. The thing about burnout is that it doesn't happen all at once. It creeps up on you. And sometimes God allows something to happen that forces you to stop. Now, I think in my story, I actually had two invitations to stop. The first one being the pandemic. In 2020, when the world came to a stop and the UK put us on lockdown, where we could not leave our homes, whilst there was definitely that niggling concern and anxiety about what was going to happen, secretly I felt relieved. The things that I had been struggling with, the commitments that I had become such a burden, now suddenly lifted. It's like I'd finally been given permission to say no. In fact, I didn't even need to say no. I was so thankful that the world had stopped. But then the responsibilities kicked in. The Sanctuary International, which usually hosted brunches and retreats, in-person events, couldn't function. And I was very aware of the need of the women that I had supported, the women who had become my friends and my sisters, who are now facing this pandemic along with the rest of us. And so about 2 weeks into the pandemic, I started Coffee with Cece, an online forum each Saturday morning where we would get together in a Zoom room and I would minister to them, provide words of encouragement, provide a space for the women to discuss and to share, a space where they could receive prayer. And I did this every Saturday for 16 weeks straight. As the pandemic continued, but we shifted into a different season in the UK, and it began to open up. Rather than take a complete stop, I simply shifted. Coffee with Cece came to a pause, as Saturday mornings women were now able to go out and perhaps eat out and do some of those things again with the restrictions. But I felt it was a good time to launch my new coaching program, Discover Your Design, which was a 3-month coaching program involving weekly group sessions and monthly one-to-one calls with the ladies who were being coached. As that came to a close, with our celebration at the end of the program in the summer, as we moved into autumn, another lockdown came on the horizon. And so Coffee with Cece restarted, back to being online as the winter nights drew in, back to being available on a Saturday morning to talk, to share. Now, I don't regret it in the sense of it felt purposeful, it felt wonderful, it felt like I was really helping. But looking back, I realized that I was not using the opportunity being provided for me to stop, for me to pause. 2021 began, and I had noticed a desire in the women to want to understand the Bible. And so shortly after the new year, I launched a new online course, run and organized by the Bible Society. I spent a few months teaching women about the Bible and its history, unaware that on the horizon, a big crash was coming, unaware that I was coming to the point where my soul and my body was going to say enough. And so we come to the moment where everything crashed. For me, that moment came when I just physically and emotionally hit a wall. My body was tired, my soul was exhausted, and one day I just couldn't do it anymore. In the background of all of this online Coffee with Cece and coaching, I was still holding down a job. And each Monday morning, I would log on to my now online forum to attend a panel, a meeting that discussed some of our most challenging cases. A meeting which I found distressing, overwhelming, and at times heartbreaking. I had ignored the sense of dread I got on a Monday morning as I prepared to log on to these meetings. I had ignored the clouds that would come across my brain after each panel. I had ignored my lack of productivity on the Monday afternoons as I just couldn't function or concentrate after all I had heard in the mornings. I ignored it week on week until one morning I just couldn't do it. Instead of logging on to the meeting, I found myself calling my manager. Not quite sure what I was going to say or how I was going to say it, but I found myself telling her I just couldn't do it. And then I broke down and cried. She was gracious. One of the best managers I've ever had, to be honest. She told me to log off immediately, told me to take a break. And the next day, I spoke to my doctor and was signed off from work. I knew I needed the time, but I felt so guilty. I had believed the lie that I had to keep going or everything would fall apart. That if I stopped, somehow I was failing. And that rest was a luxury. I just didn't have time for it. I felt guilty for even thinking about slowing down. I had built my identity on being the strong one, the one who always had it together. But God was about to show me something different. Looking back, I now see that burnout wasn't the end of me. It was an invitation from God. He was calling me to stop, to breathe, to let go of the weight I was never meant to carry. And so I came to my first well, a divine pause. I'd ignored the pause before of the pandemic, but God gave me an opportunity for a divine and somewhat enforced pause. In Psalm 23, verses 2-3, it says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Sometimes God makes us lie down. I don't know about you, but I feel often God has had to make me lie down. Not because he's punishing us, but because he knows we need rest more than we realize. He knows that those lies and those voices that have told us that we need to be strong, that we have no time for a break, that rest is laziness, that we need to be forever productive. He knows that all of those voices convince us that we don't need to rest. And so he makes us lie down in green pastures. And it's in these green pastures that he begins to speak to us. It's in that green pasture that he began to speak to me. You know, I would say he was speaking to me before, but I just wasn't hearing. Not in the same way as I did when I finally let myself lie down. And it was in that space that he reminded me that my worth wasn't in my work, but in my identity as his daughter. I had spoken to the sanctuary ladies about how to be when we can no longer do. I had head knowledge, but God took me on a journey for it to become heart knowledge. We live in a society that tells us that our value, that our identity comes from what we do. When we introduce ourselves, we are taught that we introduce ourselves with the labels of our profession, our roles. But when the pandemic hit, or when you're forced to lay down, you suddenly get confronted with the need to be because you can no longer do. And that's where many of us struggle. I had always heard that my identity was in Christ. I had always said that my identity was in Christ. But it was in that green pasture where he made me lie down that I began to understand what that really meant. He showed me that rest isn't weakness, it's worship. He challenged me to operate from a position of rest, a concept I had never heard of, and one that I'm still learning to embed in my life. And he invited me to trust him in a way I never had before. I no longer had the capacity to do all the things I did to keep things going. And so I had no choice but to trust that he was going to hold it all together. So many things were going on in the backdrop. Aside from the pandemic, family issues, family illness. But I just had to trust that he would hold it all together. For some of you listening, God may be calling you to pause, to stop striving. Did you hear that? To stop striving, to let him restore you. But maybe like me, you've been afraid to stop. If that's you, I want you to know this. God's love for you is not based on what you do. It's based on who you are. As we close today's episode, I want to leave you with a reflection question. Where in your life is God calling you to pause? What signs have you been ignoring? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Connect with me on social media, which you'll find in the show notes. And let me know, have you ever experienced burnout? How did God meet you in that season? And don't forget to join me in the next episode where I'll be sharing about the healing process, how I learned to rest in God's grace and begin the journey back to wholeness. You don't want to miss it.